I want you to take your Bible and go to 1 Kings. So we continue looking at a book a week in some unique ways, apparently. And there's lots of challenges. How do you do this? Particularly long sections of narrative. So we'll have a unique way of looking at it this morning. Life is often filled, I don't know about you, but with the idea of choices. And often there are the choices, you're either or. And life is always, many times situations in life are presented like there are two roads. You can take one of two roads. The road less traveled or the road traveled, by everybody. There's a way that sometimes Jesus says is a wide open highway that leads to destruction, or there's another road that's narrow, few travel on it, that leads to life. Barb and I had to make a trip down to South Carolina, a very quick trip on Friday, and to take Megan back, and then to meet with preparations for the wedding, and then back yesterday. And so on Friday, we ran into an accident here in 75 and going into downtown Cincinnati. That set us back. Traffic in northern Kentucky through the snow was awful. But then we got down to Tennessee. And there was a sign that said, "Construction ahead." Okay. And as we went, we knew that there was, there's going to be some construction slow. And we went past this exit. And I knew something about that exit, but I didn't know whether to get off. There were other people getting off. And I said, I had a GPS. Yes, I know. And it's like, let's keep going. And we passed that exit and got just beyond and stopped. It took us an hour and a half to go 5 miles. It was amazing. I had guys coming to me after the service, first hour, and saying, "Where was that? Because we got to go that way." If I'd have gotten off that other road, we later discovered, because as we're sitting, I'm watching those cars that got off on the side road. And it's like, So, choices of roads, choices of pathways. So Jesus says, hey, look, there's the wide and the narrow. Often things are presented in those kinds of ways. And we'll see that here in the scriptures, in particular with the idea of wisdom. There's the way of the wise and the way of the fool. The way of wisdom and the way of folly. Even Jesus said, hey, there's a wise man and a foolish man. Okay? You see this contrast between wisdom and folly. And you can make those choices, whether you're going to be a wise person or a fool. There's 2 occasions in my life where having to deal with people that I've had to say they're a fool. Number of years ago, there had a young man, he's a late teens, and he was making some choices in life that were putting his life in jeopardy, putting other people's lives at risk, and wouldn't listen to anybody. And sat across, and I looked at him and said, Jerry, you are a fool. And I use that term in biblical terms. You're refusing to listen to the counsel of everybody who's speaking into your life. Just would not listen. Yeah, years later, after we moved up here, I ran into him up here in a store. Things hadn't changed. And it's like, on another occasion, there was an older man who loved Jesus and had been a very good man in many, many ways. But as he was getting older, there was some choices that had to be made. One of them involved one of these types of issues. When do you take the car keys? You don't think that's a problem? My family threatens to take my keys. And I can tell you, it will be a problem. Well, this individual, there's no way he should have been driving. And so leaders from his church and asked if we would meet with him. We knew him. And so leaders of our church, we gathered together and we sat around and we said, look, you need to give up your car. You need to. Everybody agreed. He was putting himself at risk, putting others at risk, and he flat out refused to do it. And finally, I looked at him and I said, you are a self-centered man who is a fool. And again, use that in a biblical term. All the people around you are giving you guidance. Your family, leaders of the church are giving you wise counsel, and you will not listen. That's biblically what a fool is. It's one who responds according to his own knowledge, his own ways, who does what's right in his own eyes. When we come to 1 Kings, there's this idea of wisdom and foolishness or folly is on display in the history of Israel. And certainly, when I speak of wisdom and a king of Israel, who comes to mind? Solomon. So here in 1 Kings, we're introduced to Solomon. Now, 1 Kings and 2 Kings, really one book again, like 1 and 2 Samuel, it's divided into two. But 1 and 2 Kings tell the story of the kings of Israel. Thus the story of Israel. It begins with the death of David. David dies, and now his son, Solomon, ascends to the throne, not without political intrigue. There was another son of David who thought he should be king, and so there's some intrigue between the two, and finally that son is put down, and Solomon becomes the king. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon is marked by wisdom, at least at this point in his life. And so, chapter 3 and verse 5, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David. And it says, except he sacrificed and burned incense in the high places. Let me explain that, because he may have been wise, but he had already entered into some marital relationships with people he shouldn't have. And with those wives came their gods, and he decided to allow them to continue to worship their gods in their way. But his heart would stay true to God. Okay? All right. So the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice here, for that was the great high place. So Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. And while there, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream. And God said, ask what you wish me to give you. And Solomon said, you've shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. Now, he wasn't a child, he was a young man. I do not know how to go out or come in. I don't know how to lead people in and out of battle. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? And it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you've asked this thing and haven't asked for yourself long life or asked for riches, you haven't asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, behold, I've done according to your words. Behold, I've given you a wise and discerning heart, so there's been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. And by the way, because you've asked that, you'll have riches and all the things attendant to it. And I used the title for this morning, The Rule of Wisdom. The word rule has multiple meanings. If you take a dictionary, you look up the word rule, you'll have to say, oh, okay, you got to figure out the context, because ultimately the context, the usage, will determine its meaning. So here, for example, the rule of wisdom, I've used two ways. One, the rule of wisdom is that as wisdom would be a king, the reign of wisdom. When wisdom is in control, when wisdom is on display, manifesting itself, and people are abiding and living by or under the rule, the authority of wisdom. Okay? The rule of wisdom. The other way rule can be used is with regards to not just rules and regulations, but principles or maxims, axioms. There are certain rules that are attendant to the idea of wisdom. If you have wisdom, there are certain things that will be attendant to it. Okay? There are rules associated with wisdom, axioms, principles that come from wisdom. And we're going to use it both ways this morning in looking at Solomon and the kings that follow him. Now, if you have to at least begin with an understanding of wisdom, where does wisdom come from? You look to what Solomon himself wrote. Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs. So I think you're familiar enough with the Proverbs. And so you see this statement, for example, in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, if there's probably a parallel structure in Hebrew poetry. And so if you say the fear of the Lord is wisdom, knowledge of the Holy One is understanding, those statements are parallel. So it would be something like this, that the fear of the Lord is the same as knowledge of the Holy One. Wisdom would be the same as understanding. Okay, in the equation. So the fear of the Lord is knowledge of the Holy One. Wisdom, having to do with the exercise of choices that we'll talk about, ultimately comes from God. And what I'd like to propose to you is this, that wisdom begins in a heart that is devoted, directed, or God-centered. That's what we've talked about a lot the last couple of weeks. About life below the waterline, and about the depth, and about what that means, and having a God-oriented, a God disposition, a Godward disposition, a God-focused, a God-centered life. Wisdom comes or is associated with a God-centered life. And you see that right here in 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon loved the Lord. He loved the God of Israel. He loved the Lord who had entered into this covenant. And you read through his statements in terms of even his response to the request of God. It is a God-oriented, a God-centered request. And God grants it to him. And then what you see is right on the heels of that is on display, because the writer tells us a story that there's two mothers, one baby, got a problem. Who does the baby belong to? They're fighting over the baby. And so Solomon says, I got the solution. What was the solution? Cut the baby in half. Give a half to her and a half to her. One of them said, fine with me. The other said, no, don't do that. Let her have the baby. It's to that one that Solomon said, give her the child, because that's the real mother. See? So wisdom is now on display in the rule of Solomon, in the reign of Solomon, in how he's dealing with justice and decisions in managing and overseeing his people. And then on the heels of that comes his fulfillment of the pledge to build the temple. David wasn't allowed to build it. Solomon would build it. And so Solomon builds the temple. Now, the temple wasn't a ramshackle. It wasn't just a little hut. And it wasn't just a house. Solomon's temple was absolutely spectacular. It was phenomenal. The size, the scope, the opulence, all the things that went into that temple were unbelievable. There were people who ended up coming from everywhere and wanted to see this temple. And what's most important when you get to 1 Kings chapter 8 is the dedication of the temple when it's complete. Verse 10, that it happened that when the priests came from the holy place, the cloud, that's the Shekinah glory, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that even the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house. God in his glory comes and takes up residence in that temple. Now listen, this is significant. Okay, here at the beginning of this great united kingdom, and this temple is the glory of the Lord dwelling in the house. Because a little later, when you get to the end of Israel in the land and the end of the kingdom, there in Ezekiel, what do you see? You see the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. Okay? But what you find, even in Solomon's response, it's such a God-oriented focus in this time of his life. Okay? As he starts to unfold for the people about who God is and the greatness of God, it is so God-centered and God-oriented. When you get towards the end of chapter 8 and verse 56, he said, blessed be the Lord who's given rest to his people, according to all that he's promised. And this is what God is going to do. God will do that if we incline our hearts to him and walk in his ways and keep his statutes. And verse 59, may these words of mine, which I've made supplication before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God and night, and he may maintain the cause of his servant, the cause of his people, as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and no one else. Let your heart, therefore, be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments as at this day. What you see is Solomon saying, look, God is worthy of this temple. The glory of God and God's centeredness. We need to keep our hearts and our minds and are fully devoted, fully loving God. That's what he's saying. So you see that in Solomon. And here you see the rule of wisdom. Wisdom is because Solomon's heart is fully devoted to God, fearing God, knowledge of the Holy One. And he's imploring his people to the same. Now, you'd like to think that was true of Solomon all his life. But it wasn't. In chapter 11, as you come to the end of Solomon's life, with this issue of having lots of wives, and what they brought with them and all their gods. Verse 3. he had 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God. There's the contrast to the beginning. Let me just say something. He loved his wives more than he loved God. If you want to love your wife correctly, men, you got to love God more. Okay? You want to love your wives in such a way that's honoring to her, you have to love God more. Your love for God is what will promote in you a true love for your wife. His heart is turned away, and he goes after other gods. In verse 9, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him. You know, one of the sad things in Solomon's life is he sought for wisdom in all the wrong places, even though he knew where it was. That's what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. And what's the conclusion of Ecclesiastes? He says, look, I tried everything, been everywhere, done everything, tried everything, and when all is said and done, the grand conclusion is what? Fear God. There it is. A heart fully devoted to God. A heart that loves God. A God-oriented, God-centered life. As a result of this, God says, Solomon, because of this your foolishness is going to result in the rupturing of the kingdom. And that's what happens. Solomon's son is Rehoboam, and Rehoboam becomes king. And Rehoboam doesn't come again into a smooth situation. One of the adversaries of his father returns and says, I'm here too. So Rehoboam goes to get advice and counsel. And he goes to those who had given wisdom to his father's advisors, those who had been through the wars, those who had been through the experiences. And he said, what should I do? And their response is, hey, listen, over time, where your dad's heart was moved away from the Lord, he started to become a yoke or a burden on the people. He started to tax them heavy. In order to finance all the wives and all the horses and everything else, what did he do? He became a burden to the people. So, our advice to you is lighten up. Lighten up. Okay. But those are old guys. He's got classmates who graduated from the best universities with him. And he goes to them and he says, hey, what do you guys think? And they say, well, we think that you should just lay it on and make them think that your dad was a softie. Increase the taxes. Make it more burdensome. Teach them who's boss so you can sustain all that you want. And so Rehoboam chooses the counsel of the young ones. You know, here's an editorial comment. You go to Washington, D.C. and walk around the Capitol. You know what you see? 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30-year-olds. Everywhere. Everywhere. And you start to ask yourself, are these the people giving counsel and staffers advice? And no wonder we're in a mess. I know, I got a 26-year-old who lives there in Washington. Where's the adult in the room? But Rehoboam chooses, and when he does that, Jeroboam is ready to take advantage. And that ruptures the kingdom. So from a united kingdom under David and under Solomon, now you have a divided kingdom. So Jeroboam takes 10 tribes. and forms what is called the northern kingdom, or what becomes known as Israel. Rehoboam is king of the remaining two tribes, the southern kingdom, or Judah. So from here on, after the death of Solomon, because of the foolishness, you now have not a united kingdom, but a divided kingdom. And that's what you'll see through 1 Kings. That's what you'll see through 2 Kings, is this divided kingdom. And Rehoboam just follows in the path of his father. Rather than the path of wisdom, he takes the path of folly. Jeroboam is not a good king. Jeroboam is an evil king. Jeroboam leads the northern kingdom into idolatry. And then what follows, chapter 15, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years. So Abijam follows Rehoboam. But Rehoboam had been an evil king. Verse 3. He walked in the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God like the heart of his father David. See? He's foolish. He doesn't have a heart devoted to God. And then after Abijam, we'll come back to Asa in a minute. Over to verse 25. Now Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa. And he reigned over Israel 2 years, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. So now you have the rule of folly, the rule of foolishness. And Baasha, who isn't Nadab's son, kills him. And this sets up almost like what you see in the Roman Empire, political intrigue, taking the throne by usurping the other. And you see that through Baasha, and then after Baasha you have Elah, and then Elah you have Zimri, and finally you have Omri. And Omri then becomes the king who now sets a dynasty. So between Solomon and Omri, you've got Jeroboam and Nebat and Baasha, and you've got all this political intrigue, and then Omri comes on the scene, and Omri now establishes a dynasty, succession of kings. But you see this pattern then through 1 Kings and 2 Kings of good kings, bad kings. So if you go back, for example, to Asa, in chapter 15, and you see in verse 9, the 20th year of Jeroboam, the king of Israel, Asa began to reign as king of Judah. And he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah. And Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David, his father. Now, David wasn't his father, it was his, what? Grandfather. Okay? Great grandfather. Whatever. I need to go to that class next week. Okay. Now, look, he didn't do everything that he should have done. But verse 14, the high places weren't taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly devoted to the Lord all his days. And he brought into the house of the Lord the dedicated things of his father, and his own dedicated things, silver and gold utensils. Okay. There you see the way of wisdom. And I said, you'll see this throughout 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Good kings, hearts in the way of David, heart after David, their heart is devoted to God. Bad kings, sins of the fathers, hearts not devoted to God, God's other gods. That's the contrast now of wisdom and folly in the reigns of the kings. And next week we'll look at two particular ones as examples. Okay? Now, what's interesting is, and I'm really glad for this, is God doesn't stop speaking to the people. That in the midst of this ruptured kingdom, in the midst of this folly on display, God speaks truth to his people, continues to make himself known and his will known. In the book of 1 Kings, you see it in Elijah, the great prophet. But then you see it in other books of the Bible, okay? Because you start taking the prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, major prophets, and all those 12 minor prophets, and you start taking them and you start plugging them in to the history of 1st and 2nd Kings. And they start speaking to the nations, both of Israel and of Judah. They speak to them regarding coming back with a whole heart back to God. And so that's where you start sticking the prophets in. God still calls his people back to him. Now, as I look at this and see this unfold through 1 Kings and also we'll see in 2 Kings, what I see is that when it comes to wisdom and the heart is not devoted to God, but in contrast with the heart is devoted to God, then wisdom makes provisions. And he does it for society, he does it for families, and he does it for individuals. Okay? So when wisdom is in rule, when wisdom is ruling, it provides the basis for ethical behavior. Okay? Solomon said, I need wisdom to know right from wrong. Okay? If wisdom is the fear of God, the knowledge of the Holy One, that's what provides the basis for ethical behavior, moral behavior, good and evil, right and wrong. Okay? If, indeed, right and wrong, or good and evil, is defined by culture, okay, then whose culture determines right from wrong? If history, depending on when you live in history, determines what is good and what is bad, then it just all depends when you live, right? If that is all relative, then there's no basis for sound ethical behavior. Who gets to write the rules? Now, one of the things that's been unique and exceptional about this country, this place, is that people from a variety of cultures, from different places, with different standards of ethics, when they come here, we're able to abide under a standardized or normative ethic of right and wrong, good and evil. And they accommodated themselves to that. And historically and philosophically, we would argue that that's because it's rooted fundamentally in the fear of God. Where do people's rights come from? Please tell me you know. Where do people's rights come from? They are endowed by who? Thank you. Okay? They don't come from your culture. They don't come from your birthright. They come from a creator. They come from a source outside of ourselves. A God. A God who is transcendent, a God who's above time, a God who's above culture, but a God who then determines and reveals to us good and evil, right and wrong. So the way of wisdom provides for us the basis for ethical behavior. Secondly, it provides the framework for justice. Solomon said, I just don't want to know right and wrong. I need to know truth and righteousness. Justice and righteousness in the Old Testament are the social expressions of wisdom. How do you deal for the orphan? How do you deal for the widow? How do you deal with the poor? How do you deal with the stranger? By the way, the idea of dealing with the stranger has to do with prejudice, bigotry. How do you deal with them? You deal with them biblically from what God has revealed, what we learn from a God-oriented life. When we try to do it using human wisdom or what looks right to us in our own way, we create a bigger disaster. I'm not a civil rights expert by any stretch of the imagination. This is the 50th anniversary of the March in Selma. Okay? If you went back, who's the hero of the March at Selma? Anybody know? Martin Luther King, right? Where did he base his rights, his call for social justice? In the knowledge of God. Ultimately, the issues of racial reconciliation are resolved not by what we do and what's right in our own eyes, but in what God has revealed in His Word. It tells us how to deal with social issues. And thirdly, it provides the formula then for unity. When there's foolishness, you see division. Where the wisdom of God is, you see unity. You see a oneness. You know, one of the great places that's on display, the wisdom of God is on display, is in the book of Revelation. Where you have people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation, gathered around the throne, and they're singing. Okay? What's a song? It's a song of the Lamb, but it's a song of wisdom. It's a song. The wisdom of God is on display where He's able to take all that which is diverse and brings it together. The wisdom of man takes the diversity and scatters it and drives it even further apart. I have an axiom for you. Okay? When you look at the climate, our climate here politically, tremendous partisanship, rancor, this huge divide. I would argue that it's directly proportional to the absence of the truth or the fear of God. That the divide is directly proportional to the absence of God. And that's what you see in 1 Kings. That's socially. You know, the same is true of a church. The same is true of your family. Turn over to James real quick. Look, James chapter 3. James is the New Testament equivalent of the book of Proverbs, okay? It's a book of wisdom. And most of you are familiar probably with James chapter 1. So if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives it generously, right? That's not talking about what job you should take or where city you should live in or who you should marry. That's not the emphasis of wisdom here. The emphasis of wisdom here is how do I make the choices in response to life? And where he calls us to is a proper understanding of who God is. See? If you want wisdom, you got to have a right understanding of who God is. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shifting, or variation, or shifting shadow. Calls us to who God is. James chapter 3. Certainly he deals with justice, the widow, the orphan. This is true religion. But here in chapter 3, look, who among you, verse 13, is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior the deeds of in the gentleness of wisdom. But if there's bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't be arrogant and lie. It has nothing to do with wisdom. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder in every evil thing. You're self-centered. You don't have wisdom. But the wisdom from above is first pure and peaceable and gentle and reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. There's wisdom. Wisdom is relational. If I'm going to live in my family with understanding right and wrong, how I treat them, with being a unified family, it needs to be wisdom. So listen, moms and dads, helping your child understand ethics and morals and right and wrong, the answer is not good enough for them when you say, because I said so. Or mama said so. And when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. That may be true, but that's not the reason. Okay? You want your children to understand the right and wrong is not cultural, it is not temporal, it's not even because mommy and daddy said so, it's because there's a God who has made himself known. That's why. You want to move their heart to love God. Okay? You want to deal justly with them? When there are disputes between the brothers, disputes between brother and sister, where are you going to look to? Favorite child? Mature child? What do you look to wisdom? You want to stay united as a family, you apply wisdom. I have to be careful what I say. Some of my kids attend here, but we often used to say to our kids, because there are times when they leave, they get old enough to leave and go out on their own, believe it or not. Okay? And that doesn't happen when they go to college. That happens a lot of times when they get their driver's license. And they're out there. This is what we communicated to our kids. I hope I'm right, Tim. Be wise. That's what our word was. Be wise. Wisdom wasn't because mommy and daddy were looking. It was because there is a God who sees. There is a God who knows. There is a God who rules. There is a God who set apart right and wrong. There is a God who tells you how to deal in relationships, justice and righteousness. Be wise. Help your children be wise. And certainly, just as an individual, you want wisdom. You want wisdom. I'm thankful for the wise people God has placed into my life. I contrasted two men, young men, old men. Barb's dad, I often said, was probably one of the wisest men I've ever known. In the biblical sense of that, fully. A heart devoted to God, how that impacted his life, what he taught his kids, how he treated others, how he acted within the context of a church for unity, all those things. Wise.